post-COVID-19 environment midnight ride. Welcome, Terry.
All right, great. Thanks, AWE. Thanks to our track chair. It's a real shame that we can't all be together to do this. This is one of the events we would most look forward to every year, is the AWE conference. Hopefully we'll meet again in San Jose next year. So we're going to talk today about VR attractions and the post-COVID environment, what this whole situation kind of means, and VR specifically, and a ride we developed last year specifically that has some elements that seem to be lending itself well to the future of what this might hold, and being flexible in the spaces that we develop for attractions. So my name is Terry Sanderson. I was a producer on a ride that we're going to talk about, and I'm currently doing business and product development with Dreamcraft Attractions. And Dreamcraft has a DNA that's really rooted in real-time interactive entertainment. A lot of our senior staff at the highest levels have a long, deep background in developing games, and using game engines and applying that technology to virtual reality, augmented reality, and projection mapping, and then marrying that with attractions is where our DNA lies. At the highest levels, our CEO, our chairman of the board, they've been very much involved at the highest levels of theme parks and attractions. So we've got a real DNA in both real-time attractions as well as Microsoft HoloLens program. A couple of our founders were actually involved with the Microsoft Game Studios that were involved with the early use cases for the development of the Microsoft HoloLens. So what's the public mood right now? What we're finding is that activities, when people are being surveyed in terms of what they're most willing to do moving forward, post-COVID, is kind of what you would expect to a large degree. This is an ABC News Ipsos poll done shortly, or just a little while ago. And if we look at the data, we'll notice that there's a couple of telling things, one of which is the things that most people are willing to be involved with are largely around lifestyle. So being with friends, being with family, doing things like church, work, eating at restaurants. They're less willing to get involved with things that are a bit more discretionary and a bit more crowded. So things like flying, going to large sporting events, going to nightclubs, a little bit less reluctant to do so. And that kind of makes sense. I think we're all kind of feeling that. If we drill down a little bit into the actual attraction side of things, Amusement Advantage did a recent poll asking people, within 3 months of reopening, how willing are you going to be to do any of these activities? And it's a little telling as well when we look at the feedback in that, you can kind of tell that most people are willing to do something that's culturally and outdoors, and less willing to do something that's crowded indoor and involves the physical. So there's a bit of information there that we can work with, and where we land with VR attractions in our case is in this amusement parks FEC space, and that's right about in the middle. Those a little bit telling in that I think more people are a bit more willing to get to amusement parks, again, where it's the opportunity to be a bit more outdoor at a Universal or Disney versus an indoor like an FEC, where people are going to be more crowded together. So we'll keep drilling down on some of the data from this Amusement Advantage survey. And we find that finances, interestingly enough, even though, obviously there's an economic impact from this thing, it's not that big of a concern when people were responding. It's not the thing that's going to hold them back. Discomfort is really the key thing here, and that reflects itself in both the sanitation and the just being out in general in public with crowds. So that's people's main concern. There's still, like we saw from the previous data, a good 25, 27, 30% of people are just like, yeah, let's go, let's do this, which is great. But of course, the concern here isn't necessarily financial. It's just being in these spaces and everything being hygienic. So if we keep drilling down a little farther, what we find is when people are asked, okay, what modifications would you like to see? What's going to help you get back into a theme park or to a general attractions? And the big one is reduced capacity. People are just wanting it to be, just not have as many people around me, give me the space, and I'll be much more comfortable with that. The biggest one, of course, is things that everybody's already doing. You go walk around to the stores or into various public places right now, and you'll see all of these things taking place. And the parks are going to be able to do this as well. Having their staff wear masks, wear gloves, wherever possible, having barriers and hygiene stations, et cetera, et cetera. So they can manage that. That's easy to do. This one is their big concern, of course, is the reduced capacity, which is an expectation that people are going to want, and by far the biggest one. Because that directly impacts their bottom line. A lot of these parks depend on throughput, they depend on capacity, and of course that ticket price in order to stay viable. And you can see why. If we look at typically what you're going to experience when you go to a large park, you're going to be crowded together. So you can see how they can manage some of the open spaces, some of the queuing, et cetera. This is the kind of thing that's going to have an even bigger impact on them, which is how to manage the actual rides themselves. So if we take a look at this one, this is Leviathan. This is at Canada's Wonderland, a magnificent roller coaster. Highly recommend you trying this one out. If you look at a typical car, they've got about 32 seats on this thing. The problem here, of course, being that, well, now you're going to have to keep those people separated, and we're going to see a drastic drop in the amount of throughput. So you're going to be dropping from 32 to 8. You've lost 75% of your capacity on this one ride system itself. Not great. So when you marry that with the fact that they've got a 30% park capacity, I kind of worded this awkwardly. This isn't a reduction of 30%. This is literally, they will open up the park at 30% capacity. Now you combine on top of that another 25%, 30% throughput problem, and you've got a drastic reduction in the amount of people that you can move through these parks and through the attractions. So a key here would be, is there a way to design these things, to future-proof, such that at a minimum, you're not affecting the throughput. If you can have a reduced capacity, that's one thing, but if you can maintain throughput as it was previously, that's going to be very beneficial. So one of the things that's happening right now, or is going to be happening, or was happening last week, is Shanghai Resort and Disneyland, a magnificent park. Highly recommend this as well, as reopened. So they did do some reopenings in China for various parks, and they've had limited success here and there. They've shut down a few again. Shanghai Disney is going to be really a benchmark. If anybody's going to get this right, it's probably going to be Disney. So there's going to be a lot of people doing this, paying a lot of attention to what's going on here. And this will be very informative, I think, for the theme parks in general, in terms of best practices for moving forward. So what does all this mean for VR, for our space and VR attractions? What we think that, if you think, okay, well, how are we going to design things now, given this condition currently and future conditions, excuse me, potentially as well? So how would you kind of look at this moving forward for design perspective? The first two are kind of not really necessarily related to the attractions designers themselves. Queue spacing, pre-show spacing, so the spacing in the park itself, the spacing when people are lining up, and when you get to the pre-show area, that room just before you go into the actual attraction, the spacing within there, keeping people distanced. So largely that isn't part of our design process, that's part of the park or the master planner's process, but it's definitely a consideration. And there's something about our particular attraction that we'll talk about that kind of lends itself to how to do that moving forward. Hygienic headgear, of course. Now this is where it comes to the attractions design, where our recommendations for equipment and technologies, making these things as hygienic as possible. This is going to be the main touch point, and it's going to be literally on the face. With VR, this is going to be a big concern. There is methods for dealing with that right now, including a solution that we have, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. Assigned and numbered vehicles, if you think moving forward, how can we keep people at distance, not have them running all over the place, intermingling? If you've got people given an assigned vehicle or assigned number that they can go and methodically move their way into the attraction, find their associated seats, enjoy the attraction, and then leave again, that can be a much more managed flow. Single seat vehicles, rather than bunching people together in large groups, how separate can we make them, and how individualized can we make the actual seating arrangements for people? Limited touch points. So rather than, benches of people sliding in and then sliding out and touching all the surfaces, how can you reduce that to a single person's touch points and quickly get those cleaned off afterwards? And then metered control entry and exit. So how can you manage the flow of people such that it's not just a free for all, they're not just roaming around, intermingling amongst themselves, but control the entries and exits and the flow points. So when we look at all these things, think, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. That would be helpful to, in the future, if this happens again, then there's a system or a design here that manages that better or is more flexible. And it turns out when we're thinking and looking at this, that's kind of what happened with Midnight Ride. This is a ride that was developed opened last year for Lionsgate Entertainment World in Zhuhai, China. And Dreamcraft played a large role in that. And we're going to play for you a movie now. And this will kind of give you a brief overview of what Midnight Ride actually is and how it was put together. There we go. So that's Midnight Ride, opened last summer. That's a virtual reality ride on motion basis based on the Twilight franchise, one of the Lionsgate properties. So we had a number of partners on this. Dreamcraft was sort of the producer, kind of the central nexus, working with a number of partners that you see across the bottom of the screen here. So let's talk a bit about what we just saw. If we kind of pull back again out to the queue spacing area, you'll notice that there's these posts. Interestingly enough, it just so happened that there's 12 posts, 24 actually, but 12 posts in each row. And they're roughly-ish 2 meters apart. Now, this wasn't done intentionally given what's going on right now, but it turns out that what you could do is, quite quickly throw signs or information on these posts and have this preset ready to go spacing area. So while this gets quite crowded currently, you can see how this could be quickly and flexibly turned into a spacing exercise using just the design of the show set itself. People will come from here and they'll come into, of course you're going to see a lot of these, lots of spaces to put hygienic solutions as well. If you come into the pre-show room now, people will come in through this door and you'll notice that in the middle of the floor there is this motorcycle. And again, this is all part of the master planner and park. This isn't necessarily part of our attraction design. It just so happened to have been done in such a way that it made sense for flexible spaces for future uses, in that you can now take 12 people at a time, even though it was designed to put in 24 people. And you can see how you can actually put 2 rows of 6 on either side of this motorcycle and still have distance because of the size of the room to have them safely distanced as well. So in behind that motorcycle on the left picture, you'll see a door back there. So people will be streaming through there, but there's also room for the operator to be up in the corner, to be distanced, and to help meter people coming in and out of the room. It's the same with the entry door as well. There's an operator standing there that meters people coming in and out. So far, nothing has to be changed here. You've still got the same space, but you're able to now convert it into a social spacing space. And of course, lots of room for sanitizers. So the ride room itself, again, we're talking about numbered vehicles and assigned vehicles. It turns out that Midnight Rides uses single seat vehicles. Each motorcycle is actually identified with a number, both on the floor and on the bike itself. So if we think back to the pre-show room, if people are standing on a particular number and they're reminded by the operator as they exit, you're number 1, you're number 2, etc., they stream into the ride room and they know exactly where they need to go. And these can be sequential as well, so people can be kept at the proper distance apart and moved into the ride room, no problem. If we pull back and take a wider look, you can see that the spacing is actually pretty much socially distant. These are roughly 2 meters apart. That wasn't on purpose, of course. Nobody knew this was happening at the time. But how this works is because there's such a thing as a safety envelope, these are moving vehicles and there's rules and safety measures that are taken to keep everybody safe. So there is a specific distance that these need to be apart, and it happened to work out to be basically the same as the social distancing space. So the ride room itself, we're not going to see the problem that they had with the Leviathan. There's going to be no drop in the capacity on this ride because it was already set up and laid out to meet these requirements. The other one is touch points. So you'll see the rails up on the ceiling here. The VR headsets themselves are actually kept away from the guests in Midnight Ride. They only get brought down through this system at the last minute. People reach out, grab them, one single touch point, and they are engaged with the VR. And we're going to show you more about this engagement and the VR headset in a second. But you'll notice that there's only really 3 touch points for the hands anyway. That's the handlebar grips and then engaging with the VR. Makes it simpler for cleaning. You know where the main contact points are, and operators can, once people exit the room again, be quite quickly moving behind them and cleaning those key touch points. These ride rooms also have an entry and an exit on either side of the storage area here. So it makes for the ability for the operators to, depending on how it works best, they'll work with this over time, I imagine. Either bring 2 people at a time using the entry and exit as exits, or streaming from one end of the room. It's largely up to the operator, but there is two entry points into the room and exit points. And of course, lots of this stuff. So hygiene for the headset. So we'll talk briefly here about the solution that is deployed also on this ride, which is our Project Dream Set. This is a product that we had to develop in order for us to sell more VR rides. Throughput and hygiene were already an issue for major theme parks that have high throughput requirements. And hygiene, of course, is a concern for everybody. But when we were trying to sell high-end ride systems into very expensive, high-budget theme parks, these were the things that they're very reluctant about. They had operators that had to spend a lot more time with guests. They needed more operators, and there's just that general concern about hygiene itself. So we developed this product, and we'll run a short movie here on this. And this is the Project Dream Set. So this will allow guests to actually outfit themselves. So it was designed to be specifically distributed through the pre-show room. So operators can quite simply, or through a video in the case of one of our installations, show people how this thing works. They get it right away, and they're all preset and ready to go before they even get to the ride vehicle. The mechanism itself, I'm going to show you in a second. It's pretty straightforward. This is kind of uses the 3D glasses model with a very, very frictionless transaction where you are given a set of glasses, you wear your glasses, you enjoy your content, you discard your glasses, all seamless. And so what this does is it allows people, much like 3D glasses, to quite simply and effectively put this on. People love this. They do their selfies. They post to social media because you look ridiculous. The ride system itself contains the VR glasses. So with these small metal touch points and magnetic points on the actual VR headset, this just clips into place. Very simple. We only need 4 or 5 minutes from people in VR or in attractions in general. Enjoy your content. Comes off again. That stays with the ride system. This comes off with a simple twist and into the bin, and it gets hygienically cleaned through high temperature dishwasher. So that is completely sanitized and hygienic headset. So that is, again, part of this ride system that happened to lend itself very well to this current problem that we have and for future problems. So what's the new best practices moving forwards? So there'll be some interesting new technology that'll be developed, of course. Virtual electronic reservation systems, through apps and notifications. So you'll start to see, and there are already movements in this direction in the theme parks in general. More interactive with your phones and having a virtual lineup essentially. So it's not a lot of people lined up for hours. It's literally be at this place at this time and you'll get your attraction. Some interesting new technology coming down the pipe as well. If you're at CES this year, you saw Delta Airlines had this really interesting technology where multiple people could be standing and looking at the same screen, and they would see completely different information that would be relative to them. Can this kind of technology be deployed in parks where people can see where they need to be, when they need to be there, what rides are open, et cetera, but specific to them. QR codes for health screening is some interesting stuff coming out of China where it's known what your current state is in terms of how exposed or how at risk you are, and various coding systems, can that be used to help either affect flow through, people who are at risk or less at risk, et cetera, to use that data to somehow manage queues and lineups and entries. Pre-show distancing, of course, entry sanitizer stations, wherever anybody can, make sure that there's this stuff everywhere. This is going to be a major part of things going forward, I would assume. Distancing in the ride room itself, as we talked about, metered entry and exits, the ability to keep people separated anyway. As things return to normal, quote unquote, you can start to get crowds together again, but in situations like this, if they happen again, is your space flexible enough to accommodate that? Vehicle and cabin design, same thing. Moving forward is the ability to have people separated there, and can it be a design input that keeps throughput up? Hygiene, of course. There's various things out there right now. IMAX, UV light boxes, sanitary wipes. Of course, we'll recommend our Dream Set. We think it's a very effective solution. But this is going to need to be very, very obvious to people moving forward, even more so than it is now, which is already a concern. And surfaces, of course, operator wipe downs. So wherever possible, keep the touch points to a minimum and have a quick, easy way to clean those off in between ride sessions. Operation side of things, pretty obvious, really. Masks and gloves are going to be, people are just going to want that. We saw earlier that that's one of the big things is people's concerns around hygiene and specifically around staff. And so there may need to be some additional staff, but what we saw from the Midnight Ride example and that layout, that's not going to need a lot of additional staff if this situation does happen again, because that space is flexible. You can account for it being quite close together and packed in good times. When things like this happen, the design all works out, and maybe what you might need is a bit of additional staff for some cleaning of surfaces and a little bit of the metering of the guest flow. The big one we think, though, is best new practice is going to be actually in the attraction design itself. So design that anticipates and reduces the impact of these future social distancing and hygiene events. and then minimizes the loss of throughput. So it can be still operational, still look like a normal ride, not look like it's anticipating this stuff, but when it does happen, it's flexible enough to be able to manage it. And virtual reality attractions, seem to be uniquely positioned to manage this future risk. And what we can do here is we can keep people at a physical distance like we saw in Midnight Ride, but you can keep them together inside the attraction socially and be embodied. This ride system, Midnight Ride, actually doesn't have 4 people that are in that ride room are actually together in the same instance. So you're together, but you're apart. So using virtual reality technology, it's something that can lend itself to these solutions going forward for these type of events. And that is largely what we want to talk about today. Thank you very much, everybody. And we've got time for some Q&A.
Hey, Terry, great talk. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. We have, unfortunately, we're running short on time, so we're going to do one question. I wish we could do more. We have lots of them. But I think that thank you for sharing your approach to hygiene. So the question still is, are people going to be willing to put on a headset? And
yeah,
you talk about the different things that you do, whether it's the high-powered washer or the various steps along the way. How do you communicate that? How much of that is visible to the players or the consumer at the end of the day?
Yeah, great question. I know in the case of 2 of the attractions, we've installed this system in that there's a brief video that plays in one that kind of shows what the process is that goes through to get to the guest. So they're aware of the cleaning process involved. And in the other one, it's largely explained by the operator. So they are giving a brief demo and they are explaining what the headset does, where it went, how it was cleaned, and then it gets presented to the guest. So it's largely communication at the attraction itself that can inform people about the fact that this does have a process to keep it very clean for the guests.
Great. And just a quick follow-up. Have you done any surveys of consumers being the willingness of putting on a headset post-COVID?
Yeah, not specifically about that, no. And I haven't seen anything really specific about that. I'm sure if I dig a little further or if anybody does, they can find it. But it's probably pretty obvious that people are going to be a bit reluctant. So wherever it can be very obvious that this is as clean as possible, using various technologies to put that in your hands and make you feel comfortable, people are going to definitely be exploring that in the attraction space for sure.
Excellent. Terry, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, AWE.